somewhere around the turn of the 8th century BC, a major change happens in Europe. A new people, a new culture appears in the area of Hallstatt in central Austria. And it was completely different than anything that had been seen before in Europe. These people buried their dead in tombs, under great mounds sometimes. They were accompanied by grave goods. Some of these tombs were very richly endowed to help the deceased move on into the afterlife. They worked in iron instead of bronze, which was a major advancement in technology from what had come before. And finally, probably the most earth-shattering change that the Celts brought, or the Hallstatt people brought to Europe, were horses. And not only did they use them for transportation, but they worshipped them, they revered them, and they rode them into battle. So they were highly skilled. Dr. Barry Cunliffe, who's a very well-known archaeologist in Britain, describes the arrival or the appearance of the Hallstatt culture as a horse-riding aristocracy. And the Celts appear in this area of central Austria, but they don't stay there. They travel rapidly. They expand rapidly over the next few hundred years. They tend to move west and north, and their culture really evolves quickly to the point where archaeologists give them a new name called the Latin culture. But the question is, where did these people come from? Well, if you board a boat today in Austria on the Danube River, you can, in a few days, sail down the river, and at the mouth of the river, you arrive at the Black Sea. And it just so happens that in ancient times, the cultures that lived around the Black Sea, there was a number of them could only be described as horse-riding aristocracies. They fought on horseback. There was even chariots in places of the Caucasus and around the Danube Valley. There is a lot of evidence in the ground that seems to indicate that people moved from the Black Sea region up the Danube corridor into Europe. There's many examples. There's arm rings that were clearly Thracian construction or craftsmanship. Probably one of the most impressive artifacts that they've found to date is called the Gundestrup cauldron. Most scholars agree that it was crafted in Thrace, which was the lands straddling the Danube River down on the shores of the Black Sea. But when they found it in a bog in northern Denmark, in Jutland. And so somehow that cauldron made its way from the Black Sea to Denmark. Now, whether that was the cauldron itself that was carried there, or the craftsmen from the Black Sea moved to Denmark and then made the cauldron, it's impossible to tell, but it clearly shows that there was contact with between Northern Europe and the Black Sea area. That's a very good question, because it is one of the most exciting areas, I think, in Celtic research today. It's really being spearheaded by Dr. Cunliffe and a number of scholars in Europe. Recent research seems to suggest that there were multiple pathways of Celtic development. Somewhere around the same time that the Celts begin to appear in the Hallstatt area of Austria, another group with a similar culture begins to appear in southwest Spain, in the lands of Tartessos, which many people may recognize as Tarshish. Some of the same archaeological markers start to appear in southwest Spain. There was the appearance of what they call orientalizing material, which is material from the Near East, the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, ancient Israel, Egypt, materials that were well defined in those areas begin to appear in southwest Spain. And we know the mechanism by which a lot of it arrived in southwest Spain. The Phoenicians were trading all over the Mediterranean Sea for centuries, even before the appearance of this material. But around the same time that the Celts are appearing in Hallstatt, these materials begin appearing in southwest Spain, including inhumations as opposed to cremations, and horse technology, including chariots. And we all know that chariots were a Near Eastern weapon. They were used extensively by the Assyrians, and even the ancient Israelites had a very powerful chariot force from the time of Solomon onwards. The other very interesting development is they found these standing stones all over the Tartessos area that have inscriptions on them, written inscriptions, as well as pictures. And the pictures often are of horses, swords, chariots, all these indicators of Near Eastern culture. The inscriptions themselves have been analyzed by a Dr. John Cook from the University of Wales. And he has done a tremendous amount of work. There are hundreds of these stones all over Spain. He has analyzed the inscriptions and has determined it is a very early form of Celtic. In fact, it's the earliest Celtic inscriptions that they've ever found have been found in southwest Spain, not in Central Europe, where we've traditionally thought that the Celts arose. He's analyzed the language, and it's not purely Celtic, and he's determined that it was interacting very closely and being modified by some Semitic language that we don't know which Semitic language it was, but it was very much like Hebrew. So the Declaration of Arbroath was an important document. It was certainly an important document to the Scots of the 14th century. It was written in 1320 as a plea to the Pope for him to put pressure on the King of England, Edward II, to recognize Robert the Bruce as King of Scots. And it was a remarkable document that included a number of different facets, one of which was the history of the Scots. And it paints this picture of a people coming from the Black Sea area, from Scythia, traveling along the Mediterranean Sea, traveling through the Pillars of Hercules on their way to Scotland. No matter what we might think of that document today, one thing is clear, and that is the nobles that signed their name to that document believed exactly what was written in that document. It was a different time, and it was a time of chivalry and a time when a man's word was everything. It was the most important thing. And so it's highly unlikely that these men, which included the bulk of the aristocracy really of Scotland at the time, they all signed this document. They have fixed their seals to it. And for them to do that, that was a big step. And they were really putting everything on the line. So it's pretty clear that they believed what was written in that document. And I also don't believe that Bernard de Linton, who was the abbot of Arbroath, who actually wrote the document itself, I don't think he picked that information out of thin air. There was a number of documents already pre-existing by that time that he probably drew much of that content from. The Welsh priest or Welsh monk Nennius is probably one of the more famous of those sources. He wrote the Historia Brittonum in the 9th century, the Chronicles of the Picts and Scots, which also reach back to that time, the Life of St. Cadro, the Chronicles of the Scottish Nation. All of these talk about migrants coming to the British Isles. And then one of the big ones is the Book of Leinster in Ireland, which within that book is a document called the Libor Gabala Uren, which translates roughly the Book of the Invasions of Ireland. These invaders travel the same routes and spend time in Ireland or Gaul, depending on the version of the story, but they all seem to follow a similar path to Britain.
Subscribe and click the notification bell to receive updates about new content. Visit tomorrowsworld.org for more articles, telecasts and booklets.